Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics, everybody. Today we have the author Amy Bloom on. And Amy is the author of four White House's Lucky Us, Away, and Love Invents Us. But today we're going to talk about her most recent memoir, which is In Love, a memoir of love and loss. And thank you so much for being on today, Amy.
I'm glad to be here.
So this book revolves around what happened with you and your husband and the decisions that you made with his diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And we just want to know, what were some of the first signs that you started to recognize that something was going on cognitively with your husband?
Well, I imagine everybody's first signs are a little different depending on somebody's nature and IQ and sort of personal style. And my editor came back to me after my first draft and she said, "You don't say anything about the early signs." And I kept arguing with her and saying, "It's not necessary. Everybody goes their own way with this thing." And then I realized I didn't want to write about it because I didn't want to think about it because it was just such a painful thing. And Alzheimer's is for everybody, I think, a diagnosis made in hindsight. You see it after you hear it, after like you hear somebody go and you go, oh, because it's never, I have friends. I think if you're over 50, you walk into the room and you're like, why am I here? And you think, oh, it must be dementia. But that's not actually how it works, although it does work differently for everybody. For him, he had gotten a job he was an architect. He had gotten a job as a university architect, which he got entirely through this, group interview process, and they loved him. By the time he got home, somebody on the committee had called him and said, "You got the job. You're gonna hear from us," because he was a really good architect, and as he would say, a good team player. But within months of his getting there, he couldn't master the printer. And he kept turning to the admin in the office. And I think, understandably, the fourth or fifth time, she was like, "Brian, yeah, I cannot run the printer for you every day." And he really never mastered it. He began to work much more slowly than usual because I think part of the experience is that somebody still has, in some sense, the sort of cognitive muscle memory, but it is harder to call it up. His balance became a real problem for him. His walk kind of changed. And he would just, he fell off the front porch, he fell off the steps, he gashed his hand, pulling something out of a bush, just a certain unawareness, I would say. His proprioception altered. He also just became more withdrawn. He was a pretty gregarious guy and was suddenly sort of saying, "Oh, I just didn't feel like going. I just didn't feel like talking." We went to a get together with old friends, and the kids who were, grown people by now, had known him as Uncle Brian their entire lives. And the young woman came up to me and she said, is Brian okay? He just seems not himself." And I said to Brian, "Are you feeling okay?" He was like, "Yeah, what's the problem? I just didn't feel like talking." But that itself was such an unusual thing for him. So, he became more irritable, and also more and more talked about the past. In some sense, found the present unwelcoming or unappealing or too difficult. As the disease progressed, a little bit more from other people's responses. He wasn't always aware of it. He would say sometimes, "Oh, I feel like my memory's at 90%, pretty good." But I would perceive it as probably 50%, which is a significant drop. So I think that he was not shocked. I think he was sort of stunned. What I say is that it's like a terrible car accident. Like you see the car coming, so you sort of know what's going to happen. And then it happens, and you are always stunned, even if you're not surprised.
And you can't prevent it. It's like you can't prevent it, anything. Yeah. And, I should back up a little bit because Brian just he sounds like such a wonderful, outgoing, someone you could just talk to. So could you share a little bit with how you met and how your relationship, started?
Sure. I mean, and you're right. He was very outgoing. We used to say of all the people in the family, Brian could talk to anybody. You gave him a stump, he'd be like, "How you doing? You come from a long line of stumps. You look like you might have played football for the stumps." And by the end of the party, the person is following Brian around the kitchen going, "Can I stay later? Can I help? Can I clean up? Would you like to come over tomorrow?" Um, I don't have those skills. I don't have those social skills, but he certainly did. Um, we met in a small town in Connecticut that had a lot of Republicans, and we were not. It had a lot of Northern Europeans, and we were not. And we were drawn to each other as friends for a very long time. And then, as sometimes happens, we fell in love. And the thing I think that drew me most to Brian, and the thing that is sort of a through line for him with his life and his death, is that A, he was fearless, and B, he was game. If I said to Brian, "Honey, there is the Coney Island drag queen mermaid parade. If we leave now, we can get there for the beauty contest," he would say, "Let me grab my hat," which is just a
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful quality.
I love in your book, I can't remember the exact quote, but when you talk about how he said, you need to be with someone that doesn't mind that you're smarter than them. And I thought, what a great guy, what a great person. And so, the decision, and we'll get into that too, that Brian made and that you supported his decision is really out of love, just like your book is titled In Love. It was out of love because when I was listening to your book, I was listening to it on Audible. I was thinking, this is all out of love. This is the hardest decision that you could ever make. And trying to even fathom putting myself in your shoes and in Brian's shoes, everything was out of love. So, do you mind sharing a little bit about what Brian's decision was and your support with that?
And you're right, it was out of love. I thought for a long time about calling the book Out of Love, but then I was afraid that it would land wrong and people would think like, "Oh, now you're out of love with him." I'm like, "No, I was never
Yeah,
out of love with him. Even
right.
when I wanted to murder him, I was never out of love with him." Um, After Brian got the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and we were sort of sitting there in the neurologist's office, and after the second appointment, in which we have the MRI, and you can see clearly the effects of the disease. And after she said to him, "You've probably had this for at least 3 years. You probably had the symptoms for at least 3 years," which means you probably had the beginnings of it even longer than that. And, certainly you should go on vacation right away. You should, go mountain climbing, go kayaking, whatever it was. But there is no treatment. And if you want, you can join this clinical study and we'll put you at the front of the queue, which means if we ever have treatment, um, that will be available to you earlier than most people. But if you follow Alzheimer's research, what you basically see is, although people try terribly hard and there's a lot of brilliant scientists at work, literally every single clinical study is a failure, period, every time. And so great scientists are reduced to saying things like, "Eat blueberries, exercise." You're like, good advice, possibly not the most helpful. So, for him, we spent a miserable, just miserable weekend, just crying and wandering around sort of aimlessly, even in our own house, just unsure of what we were doing there or trying to do. And told my kids we were going to take the weekend and not be in touch with anybody, canceled all of our social engagements. And by Monday, he said, here's what we're going to do. He said, I am not making this long goodbye. We both know what it looks like. We've both seen it up close. He said, I want people to miss me when I am gone. I don't want them to be relieved that finally I have left my body long after I have left my mind. He said, I don't want to do it. That will not be a good death for me. And so we started researching, and he never wavered. And therefore, although at the beginning I did say to him, you don't have to do this. I will take care of you. I will protect you. I will keep you home as long as I possibly can. You know, I will not abandon you. I will always love you. And he said, you're not hearing me. That is not the life I want. He said, that is not a life. And I am well enough now to know that that is not a life. And so we have to act now. We don't have a couple of years to hope for the best and then live through the worst.
You mentioned that he kind of took the CEO role and you took the role of the researcher that was going to figure this out. And I think a lot of people, when they think of your experience, they go right to the Death with Dignity Act. And they're like, why didn't they just move to Oregon? And it's simply not that, it's not that simple to do. Can you talk a little bit about your research and why you kind of had to, it's not even ruling it out. He didn't qualify for that to Death with Dignity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, that was our first thought, and we don't even have to go to Oregon. We're in Connecticut. We can go to Vermont. You know, there are 10 pretty states you can go to, and the District of Columbia. But sadly, once you open up the website for those states and this particular law, first of all, you're really struck by the fact that the language is practically identical in every law, suggesting that maybe there was a guiding hand because the language is identical. And what it says in all of those laws, although there's one state I think that has maybe said you don't have to be a resident, I think, or maybe, I don't think, no, that's not right. What they did is, sorry, I'll just start that again. There's one state in which they shortened the waiting period for you to get your answer. So in every one of these states, you first of all must be terminally ill. You must be completely functioning cognitively. You have to be able to have 2 doctors attest to the fact that you have absolutely no more than 6 months to live. So it's not enough that you have a terminal illness. You must be in the last stages of your terminal illness. 2 doctors have to attest to that. You have 2 in-person interviews, and you have to write an essay. Then there's a 2-week waiting period, which is what one of the states, I believe, has waived humanely. And then you have to go to the drugstore, pick up your lethal dosage, take it home. And I believe that although a family member cannot help you ingest the substance, a doctor can. It will not surprise you to hear that very few people in the United States of America, a big country with a big population, very few people have been able to take advantage of this law. And that's primarily, as far as I can tell, because the law is not designed to be useful for people seeking to end their lives for a variety of reasons. It is designed to make sure that as few people as possible take advantage of this law, and they have succeeded. So nobody with any kind of dementing disease, including Parkinson's, is going to be eligible for this at the point at which they are still high functioning cognitively. So it's sort of a catch-22. If you're at the end of a terminal disease and you have a dementing disease, you will not be able to make use of these laws. And if you're earlier in the process, you will not be able to make use of these laws.
Right. And then I remember you were talking about the ability to swallow. So other illnesses that people might have don't have the ability to swallow anymore, that their mind could be completely there, but they can't swallow. I'm thinking of my brother with MS is a person that he
Yeah.
can't swallow. So what would happen there? So really, this book was such an eye opener to what people actually go through and what happens. So then you did so much research to try to find ways to do this. And really, so you ended up finding Dignitas in Switzerland. So can you share? So that's there's very few. That's like just that one and one other place.
Pegasus,
Is that correct?
yeah.
Pegasus. Yeah.
Right. There are now two of them. They're both outside of Zurich, which is sort of remarkable, but I guess not, given that there's a particular law in Switzerland that says if you do not stand to benefit from the person's death, it is not a crime to assist them in ending their life. And that's the entire framework under which this organization operates. So, I went down a lot of different rabbit holes, as one does when Googling, but Dignitas popped up at some point, and then I read about it and talked to Brian about it, and he was like, yep, that's the thing for us. He said, I'd really rather be at home. I'd rather have the kids nearby. I'd rather, he said, but the most important thing is that it be peaceful and painless and that you be with me. So that is what Dignitas offered us, and that is what Dignitas offers people. Painless, peaceful, and legal.
There was a glitch, though, when you were trying to qualify for Dignitas. Can you talk a little bit about the depression aspect?
Sure. And I also want to clarify for people who are not in the mental health biz, clinical depression is not like a really bad thing happens or your pet dies or somebody dies and you feel terribly sad and in some sense sort of situationally depressed. But, at Dignitas, they're very clear that they don't want to help people with serious psychiatric problems, choose this as their method of ending their lives. They don't want to support that. They want people who are making this judgment in a high functioning state. And so his neurologist, unfortunately, somewhat carelessly described, and there's a little box on a form that says reason for the MRI. And she wrote clinical depression. And when I said to her, when I saw it later, why did you say this? She said, well, I know he sees a therapist and, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that that's what I said. And I was like, but it's not true. He's never been clinically depressed. And she was like, well, doesn't make a difference. But in fact, when we had to submit the form and the image of the MRI to Dignitas, they were like, this is no good. We can't take somebody who's clinically depressed. We need a letter saying that he's not clinically depressed. You have to rebut this. And I'm like, okay. So I went back to the neurologist who simply was not interested. It wasn't worth her time. And I suspect that it also may have occurred to us that we wanted it for a particular reason, which was Brian wanting to make the path towards ending his own life on his own terms. I don't think she was very supportive of that either. So in the end, one of the staff people at Dignitas was very helpful. And she said, basically in a very nice Swiss way, I don't know how to make this more clear to you, but if you don't have a letter from a psychiatrist which rebuts this notion of clinical depression, we're not going to be able to support you. So then we sort of went on the search.
And you found your own therapist who was willing to evaluate him. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, the great
Yeah.
one. The great
Yeah. I mean,
amazing person in our lives.
it's amazing when I was just reading just the hoops you had to jump through, just dental records, and what the dentist office was saying to you and just all the legalities involved. And what also struck me was that 70% of the people who contact Dignitas don't contact them ever again.
Right. People want that assurance, which I can really understand. People want to feel, if I find myself in a point in my life where I am ready to end my life because of extraordinary physical circumstances, I can do it. And that's very reassuring to them. And at Dignitas, I have to say, I mean, these people are at extraordinary pains to support you all the way and to support you in changing your mind if that's what you wish to do. which they
Yeah.
will ask repeatedly.
You mentioned
Yeah.
also that in the time it took for him to be evaluated, that was precious time that you got to spend with him. It was a couple extra months.
Yeah.
So in retrospect, it was actually kind of I don't want to say a positive, but it was a nice addition to have time with him.
Time was very important to us. I would have been glad if we could have had the time without the endless jumping through hoops and terror that we would miss our window. But the time was very important.
Right. Yeah, this came, well, you mentioned the book, how the delays came. And then you mentioned how when this all took place, it was, right before COVID lockdown. And I know you mentioned your tarot card reader and how, that's your thing to do. And how you also mentioned, yeah, if you think that this is ridiculous, that I agree. But, the bridge, the bridge on the tarot card?
Yeah, no, and I love my tarot card reader. I think she's really gifted, and as I say, and if you find this ridiculous, that's fine with me. I got no argument. However, she is the person who said you must take the first date that they give you. And I said, well, just pulling ourselves together and everything that's involved. And she was just like, you need to take the first date that they give you because there will be difficulties. And she said, I'm not saying it will be impossible, but the difficulties will become more and more prominent. And by the time I flew back from Zurich without Brian, airports were starting to close.
Wow. Yeah, it's such a difficult process that you went through. Can you tell us, as far as you're comfortable, tell us what it was like on that plane flight over to Zurich, and how was Brian feeling during that process?
Well, in some ways, the plane flight was like lots of other plane flights. I mean, we've traveled, we've been lucky enough to travel, and there we were in first class, which we certainly had never done before. So that was quite thrilling. And, it was a slightly surreal feeling for me, which was so many of the things that were so familiar and so comfortable. But then he would go to the men's room or the newsstand, and I would realize that my heart was racing while I sat in my seat in the airport, just keeping track of how long he had been gone. And did I need to go to the men's room, or did I need to follow him to the newsstand with our luggage? Just the anxiety of traveling with someone who needed a little backup. He didn't need a lot of supervision or care, but he needed some. And that was a new experience for me. And I wanted it not to feel too burdensome to him. So I was sort of a little duck scurrying around in the background. I think for him, what he said to me more than once was that he was sad, and he was still kind of mad, but he was not afraid. I mean, he understood, this is a guy who was, I said to somebody, one of his guiding principles is if there's going to be a fight, throw the first punch. It's not everybody's approach, but it was certainly his. And I think that's how he felt about the disease, that this was not something where you waited to see what it would bring you, because he knew what it would bring you. We had seen it. And that if you wanted to act, you had to, as he said, you got to leave early or you don't get to leave at all. And
That was
the truth.
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest messages I got from your book, was really just putting this into perspective, not just hearing these little bits that you hear from other places about assisted suicide or making the decision to end your life with dignity. And it really put things in perspective, and it made me think about my own morality. Would I want that? Would I want to, just like Brian was thinking, would I want people to be relieved when I passed away? And it really put a lot of thought and a lot of understanding in your book, and a lot of considering people's viewpoints and why they make the decisions that they make and not being judgmental. That was really the message that I got from your book.
Oh, I'm glad. I mean, I think,
Mhm.
people are free to make whatever judgments they like, but I do feel that imposing that judgment on other people's lives is first of all untenable, and second of all, I have begun to feel somewhat immoral. That part of what it is to be a decent human being, it seems to me, is to be inclined to be supportive of other human beings if they are doing their best and attempting to do no harm.
Mhm.
It's interesting, right now, and Bridget knows this, my mother-in-law has Alzheimer's, and it's been an interesting journey in seeing how the different family members have reacted to this. And I'm wondering, how was the response? And I know his mother surprised you, but how was the response from the family about what he wanted to do?
Well, we had two sides of the family, his and mine. My kids, when by and large, I think mostly people like their children and think well of their children, but my kids really stepped up and were very supportive of both of us, and just 100% there for us. And all of them understood Brian's decision. I mean, they knew Brian, and they understood that this was not a man who backed down. We used to say a hard man to stop. And my mother-in-law, who is still with us, a devout Catholic, really did surprise me by being extraordinarily supportive. Also, she had seen it close up and just grieved these losses due to Alzheimer's. And also, I have to say, two of Brian's friends, both of whom he played football with, had both been diagnosed with Alzheimer's before he was. So I think for his family, I mean, everybody was supportive, in different ways. One of the things I really, really learned, I think, and it's not that easy to learn at my age, but I think one of the things I really learned was that you can choose to hold people's behavior against them, or you can forgive them. But for me, I just thought, you know what? I know I have done stupid things in my life. I know I have said the wrong thing or done the wrong thing. Not always out of malice, like I think mostly not out of malice. And, in the end, you either forgive people or you don't. So there were a couple of relationships that I would say were damaged by people who just were really preoccupied with their own deep feelings about this. Not their deep feelings about Brian, just their deep feelings about this action and the implications of it. And as I say, I have done my best to be forgiving and recognize that people have to work through their own path. I would say, if you want to be supportive of people who are in a health or a life crisis, the way to do that is to accept their decision and find ways that you can be helpful, not to try to persuade them. Or as one old friend of Brian did in sending us an email, said, I've Googled Alzheimer's. It doesn't sound that bad and you have plenty of time. I'm like, well, I appreciate the Googling, but maybe you would want to keep that to yourself or share it with your spouse or your therapist rather than with us. And Brian wrote back beautifully, I thought, saying, we are available for love and support.
Oh, that's great.
Mhm. Yeah. You don't know what something is like unless you're living in it. Even with relatives that have gone through this, I'm not in that house with them. So
Right.
I don't know what it's like every day with them in that home. And I loved your mother-in-law's response. I just felt, oh my goodness, because I can't, I think about these things and I think about what would happen. And also the fact that you said when you were talking earlier about you cannot have you cannot be, was it like a monetary gain from this?
Right.
And then I was thinking, okay, so what if I had this and I made this decision and my husband and I have our wills made out, that's another step maybe that I would need to take, is that another step to not name John in the will, or to name my husband? I don't know what that involves.
Well, that is interesting. I mean, it didn't come up for us, the
Mhm.
Swiss government did not demand to see our wills.
Okay.
Um,
Mhm.
I think, I mean, I shouldn't put it this way, but this is how Brian put it. He said, I'm an architect in America. How much money do they think I'm going to leave you? I said, well, point taken. But
Yeah.
I think, it's something to think about. One can always
Mhm.
find, a different way to manage that. But I think it was clear that, Brian's death was multiple losses,
Mhm.
and there was, of course, no gain except my getting to know that I was helping him do what he was committed to doing and needed a little help with.
For people who are wondering what it would be like to work with Dignitas, what would you say? Was it a peaceful as it could be? Obviously, it can't be completely, but what was it like working with Dignitas?
Well, one of the things that it really demonstrated to me is how hard it is in this country, um, to get health care, certainly affordable health care, but health care that actually pays attention to sort of the individual's family in any way. Um, they were across the board kind, thoughtful. They weren't perfect. There were times when we're waiting for the phone call and the phone call doesn't come. And I'm telling you, we were geared up for the phone call. We'd get an email 20 minutes after the hour saying, oh, we're so sorry, excuse me, blah, 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 we're running behind. And we would just be devastated. But, they were helpful, they were informative, they were supportive without being in any way sort of encouraging. They were just like, we are here to help you do this if this is what you wish to do. And our job is to make sure that you have the discernment and the cognitive judgment to proceed with this process all along the way. And, they make it very clear when they give you the green light and set up a date for you to go to Switzerland that it's provisional. They are not promising you that if you come to Switzerland, regardless of the outcome of the interviews, they will go ahead. They're always very, I don't mean to stereotype, but they're Swiss. They are careful, they are thoughtful, they are in no hurry, and they want to dot the I's and cross the T's.
Yeah, it's just the number of times that they let Brian know that, at these moments, you can change your mind. You can change your mind at all of these moments. So it really, really put across the point that this is not something that they're really trying to do to get rid of people. They are doing this out of compassion and out of just the name dignity, just using Dignitas, using that.
Absolutely. And they don't advertise, and
Mhm.
the people who work there are mostly volunteers, including the doctors who do the medical interviews after the provisional green light to see if they will give the final green light. These are all volunteers.
That is amazing.
And it's
And
almost always people who have gone through something with a close family member of a wide variety, either somebody who's very old and still cognitively intact, but, was a guy from Australia, he was a scientist, he was 94 years old. He wrote to them and said, my eyesight is failing, my hearing is compromised, my mobility, I really can't walk anymore. I've talked this over with my children and my grandchildren. Everybody knows I'm ready to end my life. And that's what he did.
So once the procedure happens, you have to leave right away, correct?
Don't have to leave right away. I mean, I sat with Brian, I have no idea how long. I sat with him as long as they let me sit with him. But then at some point, they have to call the police and say there's been a death. And they don't say, oh, you must be gone before this happens, but they obviously don't encourage you to sit around because it's going to be stressful and emotionally upsetting. So I sat with him and then I left and went to the airport.
You kind of had this image when you got home that you were going to just hide in bed for a couple of weeks. And that's not what happened. Can you describe when you got home what happened?
Sure. Well, there were two things that happened. One is I definitely liked the idea of sort of just kind of leaving this world as much as possible, staying in bed. My therapist did point out to me that I had never done anything like that in my entire life. And I had had some pretty serious losses. I was like, yeah, but it just sounds good, just crawl into bed and not do anything. But as it turns out, when I got home, my daughters were there. My son was texting me because he lives further away. Every appliance in the house broke down. I don't even know how to describe it. The washing machine, the dishwasher, the lights in my bedroom, the whole lot, just everything broke down. And I called my tarot card reader, who I like personally. She's not only a good tarot card reader, but a very sensible person. I said, do you think this is Brian? And she was like, no. I said, well, I've gotten an electrician and a plumber. And she said, that's what I would do. So she was like, take care of your appliances. So that was how it started. But we did actually, nevertheless, all of us persist in feeling like it was Brian, just, waving from the other side. And then it was the pandemic. And I was lucky enough that my daughter in Brooklyn and her wife and their little girl were suddenly slammed by the pandemic. They both had to work full time from home and had now no childcare. So I said, get in the little car and come on up. So they came on up and they were with me for 5 months. And I think that probably, for me, dramatically changed the course, not of the grief, but of the mourning process. I mean, I think, grief is one of those things you can put it down and pick it up anytime. It doesn't leave you. You get to move forward with it. But the shape of my mourning process was very different. What I wrote at one point was that it was as if I was in like a forest with all these dead trees falling on the ground, and all of a sudden you look at one of the dead trees and you see that there's grass and there's flowers growing out of it. And that's how it felt to me. So that I took care of Zora every morning, so that her mothers could work. And then we'd sort of hand off around lunch or nap time. And I would go to my office and sit there and cry and try to type up my notes about the book.
And before we go, I want to say that was Brian told you should write about this.
Yes, he did. And I
Yes.
like that in some interviews, people will say things like, so he asked you to write about this. And I was like, that's not what happened. He definitely told me. He was like, you need to write about this. This is about choice. And this is about sort of freedom. And this is about the right to live your life. And I said, I will do my best, because honestly, nothing else would have gotten me to write a memoir. It's not something I ever saw myself doing or ever wished to do.
I'm curious how the response has been from the people who have read it. You get a lot of emails. Have you gotten a mixed review or mostly positive?
It may be that the people who have negative feelings about this for whatever reason are just nice enough not to write, and I appreciate that. But the emails that I get, first of all, are overwhelmingly, not only overwhelmingly positive, but they are overwhelmingly from people who have some skin in the game. Some people who are like, let me tell you about my mother. Let me tell you about my husband. Let me tell you about my wife, including people who have been to Dignitas, including a number of medical professionals, hospice care nurses, palliative care physicians, wide range from all over the world. just saying this is such an important topic, and it is so difficult to raise this topic with people when they are facing, especially when they are facing a dementing disease or ALS or whatever it is. It's so hard to say to them, I don't want you to be offended, but you might want to think about some other alternatives. They said, because people simply don't think about it. One physician wrote and said, I plan to have a stack of your books in the waiting room. You know, my practice is mostly people over 50. I would like this to be a conversation starter.
Wow. That's amazing.
That is amazing. Yes. Well, I want to thank you so much for, did you have any other questions?
No,
Colleen?
I was
didn't want
just,
to end it.
no, it's
if
your
you
turn. I
did.
was letting you do it.
Yeah. I just want to thank you so much for writing this book, for sharing your story, for just bringing something else into people's perspectives, just being, I don't know, an advocate for autonomy over your body. I mean, just to give you agency over your body, especially in these times right now, because this really had a tie-in. And Colleen and I say a lot of times we try not to get political, but we feel very strongly right now that more than ever, you need to have some say in what happens to your
Choice is
body.
important.
Choice is important.
Important. And I will say that, you know, part of the reason that Brian wanted me to write about this was not only his feelings about the choice about the end of life, but choice about life. This is a guy, you know, who was an escort for Planned Parenthood since he was 19 years old.
Wow.
And as he said, it was a combination of two of his great interests. One was, you know, human rights, and the other was a certain amount of pugnaciousness. And so, you know, he liked being able to be supportive of the women as they walked from their cars to the clinic. And he spent 50 years doing it and being astonished all the time at the idea that there were people who simply wanted to take away the rights of others. And that's why he wanted me to write the book, because he wanted people, I said, to have autonomy over their lives.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And again, people can check out the book anywhere books are sold. It's In Love. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for your good work.
Oh,
Thank
thank
you.
you.